Eco Money on Money FM 89.3.
You're listening to Eco Money on Money FM 89.3 with me, Rachel Kelly. Close to 1 in 10 assets belonging to Reits across Asia Pacific will be at high risk from the effects of climate change and extreme weather by 2050. Well, that's according to a special report by consultancy XDI. Coastal inundation driven by sea level rise is the driving hazard across APAC markets, highlighting the vulnerability of coastal property. Well, that's according to the report. Now, it's not just this report that highlights the vulnerability of REITs when it comes to climate change. The 2024 Singapore Governance and Transparency Index has also indicated that S-Reits commonly identify climate change as a material issue. To get a clearer picture when it comes to the impact of climate change on REITs, we're joined now by Lee Wei Hock, who's the Deputy Assurance Leader at Ernst Young LLP. Wei Hock, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you for having me, Rachel.
Our absolute pleasure. Now, Wei Hock, when it comes to investments, there are a few sectors that Singapore investors are particularly keen on, property and REITs being one of them. And here on Eco Money, we talk about climate change, sustainability, and the impact that has on our investments. But we haven't spoken about the impact that climate change might have on REITs, for example. Now, I understand there was a recent paper published about this, but I want to hear from you. You know, the paper highlighted that nearly 1 in 10 properties owned by leading real estate investment trusts in the Asia Pacific region may be at high risk of damage from climate change, particularly those in coastal regions. Wei Hock, what kind of risk are we talking about here?
Thank you for that question, Rachel. As you know, REITs are well known to deliver stable and predictable returns. They are backed by real assets for investors. When we talk about climate change risks, and in terms of how it may impact REITs, we are essentially talking about risks under two buckets. The first bucket is what we talked about, physical risks. And by this, we are referring to the damage that climate change, as well as extreme weather events such as cyclones, flooding, or even coastal inundation, forest fire, may bring in terms of damage to properties physically. Now, the second bucket of risks that we are referring to is really talking about transition risks. And by this, we are referring to potential regulatory, policy, or even technological shifts that might come around and enforced or imposed by regulators or governments or even the market in their response to climate change risks that might actually have an impact on the continual commercial viability as well as value of the properties.
Let's take the first type of risks, for example. In Singapore, when it comes to natural disasters, it's not something that we often feel firsthand. So it might be difficult for us to understand, the kind of timeline that we're looking at here when it comes to the impact on REITs or the impact on properties that may be in a real estate investment trust portfolio. What kind of timeline are we looking at here? What do we need to know?
Right. Well, in Singapore here, we are probably a little bit sheltered, from what many other places in the world are actually facing in terms of climate change risk. And once in a while here in Singapore, you may hear about instances of flooding or ponding, But I think the research has actually found out that by the end of this century, the number of high-risk properties that could be exposed to climate risk could actually increase by more than 50%. And that the value at risks of such properties that we are talking about could potentially increase by close to 200%. These are the impact that we are looking at by the end of this century. Locally here in Singapore, I think the SGX has also now mandated listed companies to also start preparing and issuing climate-related disclosures by the year 2025, and for large private companies to do the same by 2027. In a recent study that EY and the Reits Association of Singapore has actually undertaken together, we have also found that all the Singapore Reits have actually complied, whereby they have actually prepared climate-related disclosures in their latest sustainability report. But having said that, I should actually highlight that given the vast geographical footprints, as well as on the ground sort of like infrastructure that is embodied within each of the portfolio of the REITs, it is actually a challenge for Singapore REITs to sort of like meet their net zero targets as well as benchmarks.
As you mentioned, Wei Hock, I mean, it's a really important point that it is such a vast geographical network when we're talking about REITs, right? You have REITs listed in Singapore that have a footprint globally from the UK to Europe to the rest of Asia as well. So where are we looking at? Where is most at risk?
Well, I would say that every country and every human being on this planet is at risk to climate change. But given that REITs are expected to deliver stable and predictable returns, they tend to invest in the more developed and mature markets. So countries that we are familiar with, like the US, UK, Japan, Australia, China, or even small little tropical nation like Singapore, we are all exposed to climate change risks. In fact, I think the study has also found out that properties that are actually located nearby coastal regions, they are actually most vulnerable by being exposed to hazards such as coastal inundation. In fact, the study actually revealed that coastal inundation would become the top climate risk hazard that will actually take over the rest of the hazards such as flooding, forest fire, etc. in Asia Pacific region.
As you mentioned, everyone is vulnerable at some point to climate change. What do investors need to know when it comes to managing their portfolio, when it comes to climate change and the impact on REITs? How can they safeguard their investments? What do they need to know here?
I think it's in investors' best interest to try to learn as much and read as much about climate change and the risks, as well as the opportunities that it may pose. For corporate investors like REITs or even real estate investors, having a good understanding of climate change and the risks that it brings may actually alter and impact the way that they invest, where they invest, in order to minimize downtime in terms of business days, as well as to reduce their insurance costs. Of course, for REITs, since today's topic's on REITs, REITs can also look at opportunities whereby they could also serve to differentiate themselves from other REITs, especially for REITs which are able to showcase and demonstrate very clear leadership in the sustainability space that actually help to ring-fence their investment portfolio on behalf of their investors. Now, back to retail investors, I think that it is probably good idea for them to also before they decide on which REITs to invest in, that they spend some time to go through the annual reports as well as the sustainability reports that are prepared by such REITs to understand within the portfolio of that REIT that they are considering, what are the sort of exposure that that portfolio is facing in terms of climate change risks. And I think that all these things at the end of the day helps to make investors more informed in terms of their investment decisions.
That's right. As you mentioned, Wei Hock, when it comes to investments, any kind of investment, the number one thing is to do your homework and to read and understand the risks associated. All investments come with risks and more often than not, we hope reward. But that's it. Well, Wei Hock, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us today.
I think that it has been a pleasure talking about this very important topic. I think that this is a topic that the boards, managements, they are all grappling with. And as we mentioned, it's a topic that will impact every businesses, every human beings, every countries on this planet. So thank you for this wonderful opportunity speaking to you on this.
We've been speaking with Lee Wei Hock, who's a Deputy Assurance Leader at Ernst Young LLP. I'm Rachel Kelly, and you've been listening to Eco Money on Money FM 89.3. I'll be back with you next week for more eco news and views.